3, 2, 1. Hello, third graders. This is our last lesson in The Wind in the Willows, our last chapter. So we're going to have to see what happens to Mr. Toad and Toad Hall and all his friends. I'm interested to see the ending of our story. I'm kind of sad that it's almost over. All right. So some of the vocabulary words that you might see during this lesson are deafening, which means extremely loud. So if you know when you're deaf, you can't hear. So this is something so loud that it makes it so you can't hear afterwards, after you hear the noise. Expedition, it's a noun. It's a journey made for a particular purpose. So you might go on an expedition to the grocery store to buy milk. It makes it sound more fun if you say expedition. The word immense, it's an adjective, so it describes something. It means tremendous, very large, or great. All right, then we have the word modest. It's an adjective, so it describes something. It means humble, not boastful. So modest sounds like the opposite of Mr. Toad, who's conceited. And then we have centennials, which are guards, people who stand watch. So we learned the word centuries yesterday, and centennials is a synonym for that. So it would be a guard, like the people guarding Toad Hall, or the animals. So what have we learned so far? So the plot is what's happening in the story and what's happening to our characters, the beginning, middle, and end. So we've followed Mole around a little bit and learned about Mole and Rat and their friendship and how they meet each other and how Mole meets Mr. Toad and how he gets lost in the wild wood and meets Badger. And then we start following Mr. Toad a little bit, and we see how he runs away from his friends and steals a motor car and gets put in jail and escapes from jail and all his adventures, right? And now he's done with his adventuring and he's back with his friends and he's trying to get Toad Hall back. Who has taken Toad Hall? Who has taken Toad Hall? Well, we know it's not the badger. It's the weasels and the ferrets and the stoats, right? They've taken it over because they didn't think Toad was going to come back. So Rat and Badger are with Toad. What from their reactions so far, do you think they'll let bygones be bygones? Do you think they'll forgive Toad and help him? What do you think, Hayden?
At first I think Flutter Rat the friends will be a little mad at him, but then they'll realize maybe we shouldn't be so mean to you.
Yeah, they seem pretty forgiving, right? So far they've been pretty forgiving, so I bet they'll be forgiving again. So has Toad stopped being irresponsible and conceited yet? He has. We see a little bit about that, but he also was more concerned about dinner than he was about his friends, if you remember in the last story. And he's concerned about Toad Hall right now. So we'll see if he puts other people before himself like he should. All right, so we've talked about perspective. We've been looking at Toad's perspective quite a bit. We've been following Toad around and hearing his thoughts and knowing his feelings. We switched from Mole at the beginning of Wind in the Willows. Point of view is like our first person, second person, or third person point of view. It's who's telling the story, right? So Toad's not the one telling the story. We see his perspective on things, but we have an outside person telling the story. And we know that because there's no I's or me or we or us used in the story. It's all they and he and she. So we know that it's a narrator telling the story, someone outside of the story. So the story is in third person point of view. Narration is the part of the story where we're learning about the characters and the setting, and dialogue is the part of the story where the characters are talking to each other. All right, we talked a lot about theme. So let's see if in this last chapter of The Wind in the Willows, we see more examples of our themes of friendship, loyalty, responsibility, irresponsibility, and hospitality. So one thing to remember is that badgers build complicated tunnel networks. So do you remember Mr. Badger's home and the tunnels that were under him, right? So that might have something to do with our story today. So ferrets, stoats, and weasels do not build their own burrows, but they live in burrows made by other creatures in real life. All right? Which is interesting because that's what they're doing in our story, right? They're not making their own home. They took over Toad's home. So that's kind of like what these animals do in real life. So that would be a real trait instead of just a personification, right, of weasels, stoats, and ferrets. In real life, they actually do steal homes. All right, so let's look for, here we go. Here's an example of how the animals burrow in the ground, and you can see Mole there and how he would burrow. Okay, so we are going to go back to Toad Hall today from Rat's house. They're all hanging out at Rat's house right now, and then we're going to go back to Toad Hall. So what do you think is going to happen in this last chapter of The Wind in the Willows? Will Mr. Toad be able to reclaim Toad Hall? Will he see the error of his ways and change? So let's listen carefully to see if your predictions come true. Toad was quite alarmed at Badger's serious style of greeting, but the rat whispered to him, "Never mind, he's always despondent when he's hungry." They waited in silence, and presently there came another knock. The rat, with a nod to Toad, went to the door and ushered to the mole. "Hooray! Here's old Toad!" cried the mole. "Why, you must have managed to escape, you clever Toad." So how is Mole's reaction to Toads different from Rat and Badger's? Mole seems more friendly, right? He doesn't seem as upset. He kind of sounds like he likes that Toad escaped. The rat, alarmed, pulled him by the elbow, but it was too late. Toad was puffing and swelling already. "Clever? Oh, no," said Toad. "I'm not really clever, according to my friends. I've only broken out of the strongest prison in England. That's all. And managed to... and captured a railway train and escaped on it. That's all." "Well, well," said the mole, moving towards the supper table, "supposing you talk while I eat. Not a bite since breakfast." And he sat down and helped himself to cold beef and pickles. Toad straddled the hearth rug, thrust his paw into his trouser pocket, and pulled out a handful of silver. "Look at that!" he cried, displaying it. "That's not so bad, is it, for a few minutes' work? And how do you think I done it, Mole? Horse stealing. That's how I done it." "All right. Go on, Toad," said the mole, immensely interested. "Toad, do be quiet, please," said the rat, "and don't you egg him on, Mole. Just tell us what the position is and what's to be done now that Toad is back." The position's about as bad as it can be," replied the mole. "Armed sentinels posted everywhere at Toad Hall." So armed soldiers or guards. "It's a very difficult situation," said the rat, reflecting deeply, "but I think I see what Toad really ought to do." "No, he oughtn't," shouted the mole. "Well, I shan't do it anyway," cried Toad, getting excited. "I'm not going to be ordered about by you fellows." So, does it sound like Toad is really trying to change? I don't know. He's not really listening very well. By this time, they were all three talking at once, at the top of their voices. Then a thin, dry voice made itself heard above. "Be quiet!" And instantly everyone was silent. Oh, I think I went the wrong way. There we go. It was the badger. Toad, he said crossly, aren't you ashamed of yourself? What do you think your father would have said if he had been here tonight? Toad, who was on the sofa by this time, began to sob. There, went on the badger more kindly. Stop crying. We're going to let bygones be bygones. But what the mole says is true. There are guards at every point. There is no point in trying to take the place by storm. All right, so it does sound like they're letting bygones be bygones. Then it's all over, sobbed the toad, crying into the sofa cushions. I shall join the army. Come on, cheer up, Toady, said the badger. There are more ways of getting back to a place than taking it by force. Now I'm going to tell you a secret. I wonder what the secret is. Toad sat up and dried his eyes. Secrets had an immense attraction for him because he never could keep one. There is an underground passage, said the badger, that leads from the river bank right up into the middle of Toad Hall. Oh, nonsense, Badger, said Toad. I know every inch of Toad Hall. My young friend, said the badger with great severity, your father told me a great deal he wouldn't have dreamt of telling you. Why do you think Toad's father wouldn't have told him secrets? Does he seem like a very trustworthy character? Not at all. He made me promise not to tell you about it unless you really needed to know. The other animals looked hard at Toad to see how he would take it. Toad was inclined to be sulky at first, but he soon brightened up. Well, he said. Go on, Badger. How's this passage of yours going to help us? I've found out, continued the badger, that there's going to be a banquet tomorrow night. It's somebody's birthday, and all the weasels will be gathered together in the dining hall. No weapons of any sort. But the centennials will be posted as usual, remarked the rat. Exactly, said the badger. That is my point. The weasels will trust entirely to their gods, and that is where the passage comes in. The tunnel leads right up into the butler's pantry next to the dining hall. So a butler's pantry is a special room, usually between a kitchen and dining room, used to store serving dishes. We shall creep out quietly into the butler's pantry, cried the mole. With our pistols and swords and sticks, shouted the rat, and rush up upon them, said the badger. And whack 'em and whack 'em and whack 'em, cried Toad in ecstasy. Very well, then, said the badger, resuming his usual dry manner. Our plan is settled. We will make all the necessary arrangements in the morning. Toad slept till a late hour next morning, and by the time he got down, he found that the other animals had already breakfasted. The mole had slipped off somewhere, the badger was sitting reading the paper, and the rat was organizing an enormous pile of weapons. I think the job can be done without the need of weapons, Rat, said the badger presently. It's as well to be on the safe side, said the rat reflectively. The toad, having finished his breakfast, picked up a stick and swung it vigorously about him. I'll learn 'em to steal my house, he cried. Don't say learn 'em, Toad, said the rat. It's not good English. What are you always nagging at Toad for? Inquired the badger. What's the matter with his English? It's the same what I use myself, and if it's good enough for me, it ought to be good enough for you. I'm very sorry, said the rat humbly, only I think it ought to be teach 'em and not learn 'em. But we don't want to teach 'em, replied the badger. We want to learn 'em, and what's more, we're going to do it too. Oh, very well, have it your way, said the rat. Presently the mole returned, and the four companions continued to make plans to recapture Toad Hall. When it began to grow dark, the rat summoned them back into the parlor to prepare for the coming expedition. When all was ready, the badger took a dark lantern in one paw, grasped a stick with the other, and said, "Now then, follow me. Mole first, because I'm very pleased with him. Rat next, Toad last." So a dark lantern is a lantern that has a sliding panel to dim or hide the light. The Toad was so anxious not to be left out that he did not protest. With Badger leading the way, they soon found themselves in the secret passage. It was cold and dark, and Toad began to shiver. The lantern was far ahead, and he could not help lagging behind. Then, fearful of being left alone in the dark, Toad hurried forward and bumped into Rat. The Badger thought they were being attacked and drew a pistol. He was on the point of putting a bullet into Toad when he discovered what had really happened. He was very angry and said, "Now this time that tiresome Toad shall be left behind." But Toad whimpered, and the other two promised to look out for him, and at last the procession moved on. They shuffled along till at last the Badger said, "We ought to be now to be nearly under the hall." Then suddenly they heard a confused murmur of sound, as if people were cheering. The passage now began to slope upward, and then the noise broke out again, very close above them. "Hooray, hooray, hooray, hooray!" they heard, in the stamping of little feet. "What a time they've been having," said the Badger. "Come on." They hurried along the passage till it came to an end. There they found themselves standing under the trap door that led up into the butler's pantry. Such a tremendous noise was going on in the banqueting hall that there was little danger of them being overheard. The Badger said, "Now, all together," and the four of them put their shoulders to the trapdoor and heaved it back. Hoisting each other up, they found themselves standing in the pantry. The noise they heard as they emerged from the passage was deafening. At last, as the cheering and hammering subsided, a voice could be heard saying, "Well, I should like to say one word about our kind host, Mr. Toad. We all know Toad. Oh, ho, 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 ho. Modest Toad. Oh, ho, 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 ho." "Just let me get him," muttered Toad. "Hold hard a minute," said the Badger, restraining him with difficulty. "Get ready, all of you." All right, so they were saying modest Toad, but they didn't really mean that Toad was modest, right? They were being sarcastic. They were saying the opposite and laughing at it. The Badger drew himself up, took a firm grip of his stick, glanced round at his comrades, and cried, "The hour is come! Follow me!" and flung the door open wide. My, what a squealing and a screeching filled the air! Well might the terrified weasels dive under the tables. Well might the ferrets rush wildly for the fireplace and the chimney therein. Well might tables and chairs be upset when the four heroes strode into the room. They were but four in all, but to the panic-stricken weasels and before long the stoats, Toad Hall seemed full of monstrous animals, and they broke and fled with squeals of terror, and so Toad Hall was reclaimed. "Mole, you are the best of fellows," declared Badger to Mole. So impressed was he with how valiantly Mole had fought. Toad felt rather hurt that the Badger hadn't complimented him on how splendidly he had fought. But Toad put aside his jealousy and thanked Mole for himself. Sounds like Toad is changing his ways. "Toad," said Badger, "you must have a banquet to celebrate." Thinking immediately of all the speeches he would make and songs he would sing about his own leading part in the fight, Toad puffed up with conceit. Once more, he became so inflated that his friends suspected right away that Toad was up to. "Now, Toad," said the Rat, "we want you to understand there are going to be no speeches and no songs, especially as your songs are always self-praise and gas," put in the Badger. "And from your own good, it's for your own good, Toady," went on the Rat. "You know you must turn over a new leaf sooner or later." So what does turn over a new leaf mean? It kind of means start over and start new, right? Turn it over and make something new. Start being a good Toad. Toad thought a long while. "My friends, you shall never have occasion to blush for me again," he said. "But, oh dear, this is a hard world." And so he was indeed a changed Toad. As the weeks and months went by, many tales were told of the great siege at Toad Hall. Toad became a more thoughtful Toad, and life on the riverbank continued, as did the friendships of the creatures with whom you have become acquainted. All right, that is the end of our story for Wind in the Willows. So they've kind of gone back to normal. Toad has Toad Hall back. He's changed his ways, right? He's turned over a new leaf. And he's become a better Toad with the help of his friends. So were your predictions correct about Toad and how he would reclaim Toad Hall? What about you, Cadence? Did you think that would happen? He'd get it back?
I thought he would get it back.
Yeah, good. Why didn't Toad's father tell him about the underground passageway? What do we think? Why didn't Toad's father tell him about the underground passageway? Right? Toad wasn't very good at keeping secrets. Not very trustworthy, was he? If I was his father, I wouldn't have told him either. Do you think that was wise of Toad's father? Why or why not? I would think it was wise. Why do Badger and the others want to use an underground passage? What is it that makes it hard to get into Toad Hall? Right? It's a secret passage into the house in the middle of the house, and there's sentinels guarding the outside of the house, so they wouldn't have been able to get in without being seen. Where does the underground passage lead? Do you remember? Where does it lead to? It leads to the pantry, the butler's pantry in Toad Hall. How are Rat, Toad, Mole, and Badger planning to use the underground passageway? They're going to sneak into the house and surprise the weasels, ferrets, and stoats. Toad is in ecstasy about the possibility of whacking them, right? He says he wants to whack them. All right. So we know that they were able to come in because the weasels and ferrets and stoats were having a party that was really noisy, so they could sneak in. Why do you think Rat tells Toad that he should turn over a new leaf or start over again in his life? Why does Toad need to turn over a new leaf? Right? They are going to let bygones be bygones, and he needs to not be a rotten apple anymore. Right? This is a good time for him to start being responsible instead of irresponsible and to be a good Toad. After the four friends get Toad's mansion back, Toad's feelings are hurt because Badger compliments Mole and not him. However, Toad compliments Mole and thanks Mole for his help. Do you think that Toad would have been able to put aside his jealousy and thank his friends before all of his adventures? At the beginning of the story, would he have been able to do that when he was a conceited Toad? Do you think Toad has changed since we first heard about him? Why or why not? I think he's changed a lot. He's learned the error of his ways. He's learned from all his adventures not to lie and steal and cheat and to put others first. I think that's pretty cool. Okay. In real life, can escaped prisoners simply go back to their own home without the police arresting them again and returning them to prison? No, they can't, right? What kind of story is The Wind in the Willows again? It's a classic. Remember, it's a classic tale, so it's one that is an older story, and people keep reading it over and over. And what kind of fiction is The Wind in the Willows? If you remember right, it is fantasy. We have animals talking and different things that couldn't happen in real life. There's lots of personification. Our word for today is modest. In the story today, you heard the weasels, ferrets, and stoats were toasting modest Toad and laughing at his expense. Say the word modest. If you are modest, that means you are humble and don't show off. All right? So Toad is the opposite of modest. He's conceited and prideful. But then he gets a little better at the end of the story. All right. Good job, guys. I'm kind of sad that our story's over, but you've been working really hard. And tomorrow, we're going to have our test over the story, and we're also going to watch the movie. Good job, guys.